Okay, I think we should get started. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on understanding historic interior designation. I'm excited to present this topic. It's something that I think is very interesting. Before we do that, we'll just talk briefly about DCPL for some of you who might be new to the organization or today's webinar. We are Washington, D.C.'s citywide nonprofit founded in 1971 that is dedicated to preserving, protecting, and enhancing the historic built environment of the nation's capital. I have a few things to go over before we get started. First, I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors, whose annual financial support helps underwrite free programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, QTAC Rock, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Beyer Blinder Bell, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Thank you for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So moving on, we have a few notes on how today's webinar will run. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A box found at the bottom of your screen, and I will get to those at the end of the program. And then the chat will not be available during the presentations, but it will be open for the discussion portion, and maybe we can read some of the different comments, or if people have particular thoughts or feelings about any of the historic interiors or some of your favorites, I would love to hear some of that. So now that we've got that covered, I'm excited to present today's topic. So some of this material might look a little familiar at the beginning if you've ever sat in on my presentation about historic designation, because some of the material is a little fundamental and you just have to know sort of how the rule book works before you can talk about historic interiors. So DC's Historic Preservation Ordinance dates to 1978, the DC Historic Landmark and Historic District Protection Act. And this created the framework that we have today in the city when we talk about preservation, and some of the alphabet acronyms that you hear thrown around. So this created the Historic Preservation Office, which is the professional staff, and they support the Historic Preservation Review Board. And HPRB is composed of 9 members appointed by the mayor and approved by the council. And they handle historic designation, what we're talking about today. And then a lot of what they do is design review, which is looking at these alterations in historic districts or to historic landmarks and seeing if they are compatible. And the board has to make their own decisions based on the preservation law, but they get staff recommendations from HPO. So you can see how it's a really important relationship where the staff and the board work together to come to preservation solutions. And DC has a very good preservation ordinance. And by that, I mean, we have a very strong preservation ordinance if you're into preservation and you support preservation like DCPL. And by one of the ways we have a very good preservation ordinance is when HPRB makes a decision about a designation, it's final. Now, in a city like New York City, the Preservation Commission, the Landmarks Preservation Commission there, they'll make their decisions, but they still have to be approved by the New York City Council. So we don't have that in DC, and I think you can probably see how that means that that's one way we have a good, strong preservation ordinance. So HPRB, by designating properties, they also are managing this DC inventory of historic sites. And that's our local collection of landmarks. Now here in DC, it mirrors pretty much what's also in the National Register, but it's not always a complete crossover, but generally it's a pretty good crossover, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And then there's something I really want to point out, which also makes DC's Historic Preservation Ordinance a very strong ordinance. DC does not have owner consent. So to be in the DC inventory, the owner doesn't have to sign off on the designation. Now, if you want to get that property also listed in the register, you do have to have owner consent for the National Register. That was added in 1980 by Congress when there was interest in having some kind of owner buy-in, I guess you could say, to the designation process. So that's a very important distinction between the two programs. And oftentimes, if DCPL is working to get something listed in the National Register through a National Park Service grant, it's very important that we get owner consent because it's part of the National Register. And then I also want to mention, finally on this slide, local designation versus national designation. When preservation has talked about the regulations and really where the teeth of the regulations are, they're at the local level. And if you don't believe me, I have this quote from the National Park Service, and they say on their website, listing in the National Register places no federal restrictions or requirements on private property owner. You may do with the property as you wish within the framework of local laws or ordinances. So notice that last phrase there. It's saying that DC's ordinance or any ordinance around the country, that's really where the regulation is. If you are going to try and alter a property or demolish a property, you're going to have a problem from a local level if there's a municipal ordinance, and there's not municipal ordinances everywhere, but in a city like DC there is, of course. It's not the National Park Service or the Department of Interior that's going to come in and stop you from demolishing your property. For the most part, the National Register is more ceremonial. It's nice to have this history, culture, architecture listed in our national record. And of course, there's the federal tax credit, but for the most part, it's more honorary, where the local level is where you have that regulation, that planning law, the land use law, all that's the local level. So let's talk about the two types of historic designations in DC. So remember I said the National Register and the DC inventory, they follow pretty closely, but there's not complete crossover, and you see that here because there's over 700 sites in the district that are listed in the DC inventory, but only about 600 plus that are in the register. Now, this always just amazes me every time I read this fact, that more than 27,000 contributing buildings in over 70 historic districts here in the district. So yes, there's a lot of landmarks, as you see there, 700 plus, that includes historic districts, but 700 plus, but there's thousands and thousands and thousands of buildings that are just contributing buildings to a historic district that are not landmarks, but they're part of the historic district and they have to undergo design review. Now, you're probably thinking, well, when are we going to talk about interiors? Well, here's our first fact about interiors. There's 22 landmarks with designated interiors. So you can see here, it's a very rare designation to have an interior designation. And it's kind of a big deal, actually, when you think about it, that out of 27,000 buildings in the district, only 22 have designated interior spaces. I will also just mention that we have National Historic Landmarks. That could be another topic we could talk about another time. That involves the Secretary of the Interior. There's only 78 here in the district. And something that I like to say at DCPL, I know my colleagues like to say, is that just because something is a landmark or it's in a historic district, that does not mean that change can't happen. Change happens all the time. That's a lot of what HPO does. That's a lot of what HPRB does. They're reviewing compatibility through design review, and constantly stuff is happening. I know they have tens of thousands of permits that go through their office every year for changes, and 99.9% of them are, approved in some way. Maybe there's tweaks and whatnot, but they have a good approval process. And designation does not regulate use. That's something we also like to emphasize here. That's through zoning. And it's important to mention or just point out that planning and preservation, they're very much sister fields of study, right? And you have to have planning to have preservation. You have to have preservation to have planning. Okay, so when you look into the DC regulations, so there's the DC law, the ordinance from 78, and then there's regulations, right? We all know that living in DC, that there's laws and then regulations come out of laws, right? We get that ingrained in us living in the district. So it's the same at the local level. So from the DC regulations, they say historic and prehistoric buildings, building interiors, structures, monuments, works of art, or other similar objects, areas, places, sites, neighborhoods, cultural landscapes. These are all eligible for designation as historic landmarks or historic districts if they possess one or more of the following values or qualities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it actually mentions building interiors in the regulation. Now, you won't find that in the law, but if you look into these regulations where I have here, for some of the people that are more interested in looking at DC regulations and the DC code, that's where you can find this language. So this is what you have to meet to be in the National Register and or the DC inventory. Both programs cover historical and architectural significance. They cover integrity, and then there's a vague term, historical perspective. This is usually distilled into the National Register's language, the National Register Criteria Consideration G, which says listing is possible for a property that was built within the past 50 years if it's achieved exceptional importance. So generally, people wait until, we're in 2025 now, so now they're designating stuff in 1975, right? That doesn't mean that something can't be listed from 1985 or 1995 or maybe even 2005, but you're going to have to make a stronger case. Why is it so exceptional that we're going to list it before 50 years? So generally, preservationists think in these 50-year timeframes, which some people I tell this to and they're horrified, thinking, oh gosh, a 1980 shopping center, that could be historic, in 10 years. And it's like, yeah, it actually could be. But I think it makes it interesting, and it makes it so we're always thinking newly about the built environment and what is historic. So significance criteria. DC inventory versus the National Register. So the DC inventory has these 7 criteria that cover events, history, individuals, architecture and urbanism, artistry, work of a master, archaeology. So to be listed, you have to meet at least one of those. And the same goes for the National Register. And you can see the crossover here. The National Register has less criteria to look at, but you can see how events and history in the DC inventory, that becomes just event in the register, and individuals as person in the register. And then DC has architecture and urbanism, artistry, work of a master. Those are all collapsed into just one, design and construction in the register. But you can see that the ordinance and the regulations, they were based on the register, because the ordinance came about 12 years after the National Historic Preservation Act, which created the register. And this is very common throughout the country, where a lot of local ordinances and local criteria, significance criteria, is based on the register. And then National Register has criteria considerations. That's like the thing about 50-year rule. And I think another misunderstanding about the register is you can be listed in the National Register for national, state, and or local significance. You know, it's kind of odd. But just because you're in the register doesn't mean that it's only listed because it's nationally important, right? Then that would mean we only get, you know, houses related to presidents and senators and things like that listed. And we know that's not the case. For example, recently we got a designation for the Latin American Youth Center, right? That's not nationally important, but it's significant to our nation's history. So it's listed, I think, on a state or local significance, I forget which one. Both programs cover integrity. This is a whole other topic we could get into, but you know, the integrity, which comes through character defining elements or features, that supports the significance. And it can be a little esoteric to think about, but you have to have some physical remnant of the property represented in its significance. And really the most simple way to think about this, I don't know where I come up with this example always, but I'm like, you know, if you're listing Herbert Hoover's house, the president, like, would he recognize the house that, you know, you're listing? And it becomes more important for architectural significance, but it's also important for history and events. So integrity comes down to location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Another good example when you're talking about integrity, preservationists don't really love when a building's moved, because that affects the integrity, that affects location and setting, that could also affect feeling and association. So that's another example of how integrity can be compromised if a building's moved. That's why a preservationist isn't crazy about like a pioneer village where they brought a bunch of buildings to a site and then reassembled the streetscape, right? Because it's not historically accurate. So a lot of different things you can think about integrity, but integrity is really important, and it supports criteria significance. So let's start talking about interiors now that I've given that introduction to get us to this topic, but that's the important background you need to have. So I was looking into, you know, how do you talk about historic interiors in the National Register context? And National Park Service has this really great collection of what they're called preservation briefs that were developed by Technical Preservation Services over the years. And they still publish new ones. This one's a little bit older, but this is about determining visual character of a building or structure through 3 different steps. And they look at the exterior and the interior, but specifically with the interior, they talk about individually important spaces. So today when we're talking, individually important spaces for some of these interior designations would be like a banking hall and a former bank, or like a lobby of a hotel, or I shouldn't say a hotel because a hotel is not listed, but a lobby of a apartment building. And then also related spaces. What are the important supporting spaces to this lobby or this banking room? Should additional spaces be designated? Maybe there's a side lobby that has the elevator space. Like, should that be included in the interior designation? So it's important to think of these different spaces and how they connect and how they support each other, and what's significant and character defining to this building and what's not as important. Features can include, interior features are 3-dimensional building elements or architectural details that are an integral part of the building as opposed to furniture. So that's an important thing to think about too. This is more so the stuff that you can't easily move in and out, right? Interior features are often important to defining the character of an individual room or space. So staircases, fireplaces, plaster medallions, paneling, light fixtures, teller cages, and so on. So speaking about integrity, can you see how it would be hard to list a lobby? Say the lobby's beautiful and it's in this 1930s Art Deco building, But let's say it was altered multiple times, it's never been restored. Can you see how by losing those character defining features, you're losing integrity? And that's also kind of going to bring down your whole significance argument, right? They all support each other. And so that's why it's important to have features that have lasted throughout the years. Or we were just at a tour at Warner Theater last week. When they did the 1992 rehab, they restored a lot of these features, and Warner Theater is an interior designation because they restored a lot of these features that support the initial significance of the property. And then, of course, there's also surface materials and finishes, stone, including like marble, granite, things like that, that obviously affects the feel of a space. So, types of historic interiors in DC. Now, I want to emphasize before everyone goes out and they're trying to sneak into these spaces that these are public and private spaces. So just keep that in mind as I go through this list. Some are very publicly accessible. If you want to go see Eastern Market, that's really easy to do. If you want to go to Folger Shakespeare Library, just go during their operating hours and they're very open to you walking through the space. But there are some private residences on here, so you have to keep that in mind. So it's public and private, but that's an important thing to show that you can have a public or private space get designated, right? Remember when I told you about owner consent here in DC? So what are the different types of properties that are listed here for interiors? So we have 6 apartment buildings, 4 private residences, 2 libraries, 2 schools, 2 banks. We have a public market, I said Eastern Market, a government building, an art gallery, theater, restaurant, and shopping arcade. It's actually a pretty good assortment and cross-section of different types of buildings and uses. But you can see there's definitely a concentration when it comes to residential, right? I mean, 10 of the 22 alone are related to residential properties. And I'm going to go through all these. So, because I know people are probably thinking, well, what are they? I want to know what they are. Okay, so let's talk about the apartment buildings. There's 6 apartment buildings. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Northumberland. This was listed in the inventory in 1978 and the register in 1980. This is an Albert Beers designed building. It's a very gorgeous building in New Hampshire and V. It was designed by Albert Beers for Harry Boardman. And the nomination says the exterior of the Northumberland, in spite of its variety of materials and architectural elements, hardly prepares one for the explosion of decorative features and materials in the main public space of the building. The lobby has been described as unique among Boardman's many buildings. Some connoisseurs of architectural history consider it the most distinctive lobby in the city. How's that for an argument, a nomination? That's a very compelling argument, right? It makes me want to go visit that building, maybe see a listing in there. So that's the Northumberland. Let's talk about the Wyoming. I just talked about the Wyoming. If some of you joined me on my Adams Morgan tour, that's a great building designed by B. Stanley Simmons. It was constructed over 3 periods, 1905, 1909, 1911. That has an exterior designation from 1980, but in 83, they added the interior, and it was also added to the register. It's a Beaux-Arts building right there on Columbia Road. And the interior designation, if you're familiar with the Wyoming, there's a little entrance pavilion that's shorter than the 2 apartment towers, you could say. And that the nomination for the interior is focused on the entrance pavilion. And the nomination says, the interior of the pavilion is even more splendid than the facade. Extraordinary plaster, marble, and mosaic work is among the finest found in any Washington apartment house lobby. Planned in a modified cross shape, the Wyoming's public lobby is composed of columns and wainscoting of oyster-colored marble, strongly veined in gray, plaster walls, moldings, and ceilings, and decorative mosaic tiled floors. Another really compelling argument. And if some of you are familiar with James Good's Best Addresses, Northumberland, the Wyoming, these buildings we're talking about today, these are all in that Best Addresses book. So if you want to read more about the history of these individual buildings in addition to the nominations, that's a good reference point for these buildings. Alban Towers, many of you are probably familiar with that, in Massachusetts and Wisconsin, just kitty corner from the cathedral. That's that really spectacular Gothic and Tudor Revival building, designed by Robert O. Schultz in 1929. And then there's the Wardman Tower and Arcade over at, let's see, here's that Woodley Road in Connecticut. That has an exterior designation from 1979, but more recently in 2018, the interior was designated. And the lobby designation, it says in the nomination, or rather in these design guidelines that were put together by HPO for that building, the Wardman Tower and the lobby interior has been designated as a DC landmark. The interior designation is restricted to the lobby, including the seating area, a portion of the former south entrance wing, and the east arcade wing that connects to the present hotel. And I think I want to point out that language because some of these nominations that are older, they're actually somewhat a little vague about what exactly in the interior is included. It seems from my reading that over time, the city, and maybe someone from the city who's on here, they can maybe chime in on this at the end, it seems that they've gotten a little bit more specific about what an interior includes, because some of these, it's not totally clear. For example, I was reading Alvin Towers, and I'm like 99.9% sure it's focused on the lobby, but the nomination doesn't really give the reader the best idea of what is included. And I noticed with the Wardman Tower and Arcade designation, they have very detailed information about the contributing and non-contributing elements in Wardman Tower, right? And then I'll mention 3901 Connecticut Avenue Northwest, up just in the north end of Cleveland Park near Tilden, I believe. That was designed by George T. Santmeyers. He was a prolific apartment building architect. That was completed in 1927. And then the one I want to talk about a little bit in detail, and by the way, this is the lobby from 3901. This is what's included in the nomination form from 1995. The one I want to talk about a little bit in detail is Sedgwick Gardens, which this is a building I've always admired walking or driving down Connecticut. I think it's really a stunning building. This was added to the DC inventory in 2015 for the exterior and interior, and the nomination is very specific. It says this is for the entrance lobby and the elevator lobbies. It was listed in the register in 2016 under criteria A and C. Remember, that's events in history and architecture. Criteria C is that significant architecture one. And the nomination co-sponsors were the Cleveland Park Historical Society and Art Deco Society of Washington. A shout out to them. We've collaborated with them on many projects over the years, and they co-sponsored this nomination. This was designed by Miron Mesrovian. He also did, if you're familiar with the St. Regis at K and 16th. He's this very significant local DC architect, and he designed this stunning Art Deco building up on Connecticut in 1932. I'll show these pictures. I know they're not the best quality, but you kind of get an idea of this lobby. The nomination says architect Miron Mesrovian's eclectic and highly creative use of Art Deco, Middle Eastern, and Romanesque elements for the decoration of the facades, the porte cochere, which you see the top of here in this image, and interior spaces make Sedgwick Gardens one of the most distinctive apartment houses in the city. Indeed, the lobby is unique, an exuberant statement of Mesrovian's artistic expression given shape by the creative eclecticism of the Art Deco movement. Only one other Washington apartment house lobby, that of the Cairo, which is actually not an interior designation, but the Cairo, built in 1894, could match its opulence. Even its hallways are exceptional in their massing and ornamentation. Mesrovian designed the interior and exterior of Sedgwick Gardens as an ensemble. See what they did there in the nomination? They basically are saying you can't talk about the exterior of the Sedgwick Gardens without also talking about the interior because they're so interrelated, right? And so hopefully you enjoy these pictures. I'm sure many of you have been in this building. I've never actually been in this building, but I do admire the outside of it. Okay, so now we have 4 private residences that are listed with interior designations. I think there's one that's probably the most famous on here that people are seeing right now, the Christian Herrick House on New Hampshire, just south of the Circle in DuPont. This is sometimes called the Brewmaster's Castle. It's a really great example of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture here in the district. And this building was actually listed a very long time ago in '64. It was listed by the Joint Committee on Landmarks, which was a predecessor to HPRB. It was very honorary. It didn't have the power HPRB did, but it was really DC's initial list of important landmarks. So this was listed in '64, but the interior wasn't added to 2002. It was designed in 1892, or rather completed in 1892, designed by J.G. Myers, and this designation includes all interior spaces. The same goes for the Barney Studio House over near Sheridan Circle. This is a Mission Arts and Crafts style private residence that was added to the register in 1995. Alice Pike Barney, she was an artist, a community activist, producer, and founder of the Sylvan Theater. You can see the picture of this dining room in here to give you an idea of that Mission Arts and Crafts style. The William L. Slayton House in Cleveland Park up on Ordway Street. This was listed in the register in 2008. This is an international style triple vault poured in place concrete roof. That's really the character defining feature here, but this is also focused on the interior of that residence. That residence, of course, was famously designed by I.M. Pei. This is one of his early works back in 1960. The nomination says, because the transparency of the house unites interior and exterior, and because the volumetric aspect of the simple interior is critical to its significance, this nomination includes the house interior, so all the interior. And then I want to give a special shout out to the John Joseph Early House. This was our most recent nomination that DCPL did with the homeowners. The homeowners of this property, Raymond DePhillips and David Elfith, they have been really great stewards of this property since they purchased it in the late 1980s. And the interior really is stunning. I'll have some pictures in a minute. But this is an Italian Renaissance Revival design. And it was designed by Waddy B. Wood for the architectural sculptor, John Joseph Early. Early did a lot of work, concrete work. He was a pioneer in the use of concrete. And you can see his work most prominently at Meridian Hill Park, but that's just scratching the surface. He did work all over the place, but that's probably his most famous for a lot of people here in Washington. So this was completed in 1911. And when we put together the nomination, we were very specific about what it was covering, right? So we included the entrance hall, the parlor, the center hall, the atrium, and the dining room. Most of the first floor except for the kitchen, which wasn't historically significant. So really, the thing I find so incredible about this house is you're looking at it, you know, it stands out in Mount Pleasant. It doesn't totally fit in with the usual rhythm of the street, right? When you're up on some of these streets and you see the row houses, you can tell it's a unique house, but then you go inside and there's this atrium and you're just like, what? How is this atrium fitting in this row house? It's absolutely stunning. So I wanted to include these pictures. And you can see up there to the second floor, which is not included, but the atrium is included. Okay, libraries and schools. There's 4 that fall into this category. We have Parkview School, which is a Tudor Gothic revival style. This was added to the DC inventory in 2012. It was designed by Snowden Ashford, who was DC's municipal architect. So he did a lot of designs related to schools and other public buildings. Yeah, why this school, right? Of all the schools here in the district, it's now called Bruce Monroe Elementary School. This interior designation is really focused on the building's 700-seat auditorium. The nomination says no other elementary school before 1949 had its own dedicated auditorium, although some had gymnasium, cafeteria, auditorium spaces. And such multipurpose rooms did not compare to this soaring space with its balcony and remarkable complicated trusses, clearly calculated to serve as a public meeting and performance venue. Inside and out, Parkview is a superior specimen of the public elementary school. How's that? Superior specimen of a school, right? You can see why it has an interior designation. We have the MLK Library. Many of you have probably come to DCPL events at the library or DC History Conference, right? This one, you know, it goes without saying, this is a Mies van der Rohe design. This falls into that bucket, you know, with the I.M. Pei house. This is a really internationally famous architect designed this building. This is Mies' only work in the district, and he actually passed away before it was completed in 1972. I also think this is a great example because this shows, like I said earlier, that designation does not preclude change, right? If you go to the library, you can tell it had a really significant modernization. You know, you go into that main area, like this reading room, or you go into the entrance lobby, and it does feel like 1972, right? And you have this really great horizontality with these light fixtures, and you have the glass, which is very Miesian, where you can see out into the street, and the street can see into the building. But then you go on the stairwells, and they're totally modern, right? Or you go up to that rooftop terrace, and that shows that designation all the time. Buildings are changing, evolving, becoming more interesting. So I think this is a great example of change with historic designation, including even an interior. Folger Shakespeare Library. That's the one I wanted to give special attention to in this particular section. This is one of the early DC landmarks. Like I said, the Joint Committee on Landmarks. This was designated in '64, the exterior only. The interior was added in 2018. And then the register, you know, the dates kind of match up with the register too. As you can see, it was listed for history and architecture. The interior nomination was sponsored by the Folger Shakespeare Memorial Library, and they wanted to recognize the significant interior spaces of this building, which if any of you have ever been in this building, I think you're gonna know where I'm going with this when I show the reading room. This is a Paul Philip Cray design. He's another significant architect, not just in DC, but nationally. It was designed in the strict classical style. When you walk around, you see the outside of it. You can tell it's a very 1930s era building, right? And it fits in with the nearby Library of Congress Adams building, and it fits a lot of the DC aesthetic. But then you go in and it's totally opposite. It's Tudor Jacobean revival. And and you can see the different spaces here, right? There's the theater, the reading room, the exhibition gallery. I'm sure many of you have walked through this space. And by the way, just a plug for the Folger, they recently did that rehab, another example of change of the building, and they added a whole museum space under the historic structure, which is really just awesome. So you see here, you can see on the left, you have this bas reliefs from different Shakespeare tragedies, and I think they're all tragedies, actually, the ones on the building. Other than any comedies, maybe there's one. But you can see the strict classical design, right? And then look at that contrast. This is the reading room inside the building. And the nomination mentions how, for example, this reading room has 11 stained glass windows. And the one that I really like is the one that's on, I guess it's the west side of the building, the one here on this image on the right. And this has different scenes from the Seven Ages of Man, which is from Shakespeare's play, As You Like It. So this is just a really cool space. And like I said, if you go to the Folger during, the regular business hours, you can definitely go see this room. I think it's almost always open to the public to walk around. And the Folgers are actually, their ashes are interred here under that bust of William Shakespeare, which is another interesting feature of the building. Okay, Franklin School. This is another old nomination, and by that I mean it goes back to 1964. This was also an early building that DCPL, when it was Don't Tear It Down, that was significant in saving this building. So this one is special to DCPL as an organization. The interior was added in 2002. We're obviously recognizing the history and the architecture. This is a National Historic Landmark, so this is kind of rising above all the other ones we've talked about so far, because this was actually designated specifically by the Secretary of the Interior in '96 as a National Historic Landmark. This is designed by Adolph Kless, a significant DC architect who had a really unique flair and design. For example, this building is hard to categorize, really, when you're using typical American architectural terms. It's not really Italianate, it's not really Queen Anne, it's not really Second Empire. And one of the styles that they talk about is the Rumbo-Genstel. I haven't spoken German since high school, but that's the round arch style, which is common with, as you can tell from that word, Germany, where Kless was from. So this is a very significant building. It definitely stands out in the streetscape of downtown Washington. And I wanted to mention this one in particular because here's some pictures that were done by Habs back, I think in probably the 60s or 70s. And this building, as many of you know, this sat derelict for many years, and then it was converted to Planet Word Museum, another example of change that happens. But this is an example of how it's really important to be vigilant about designation, and particularly with interior designations. As many of you are probably familiar, back in 2018, it came out that when this was being converted to Planet Word, use as Planet Word Museum, there was destruction of the historic character-defining features in this building. A Washington Post article says in 2018, we are writing to document, this is David Maloney, who is the head of the Historic Preservation Office in the district. He says, we are writing to document that significant amounts of historic fabric have been removed from the building without prior authorization. This was a big story in the preservation world back in 2018. This included plaster, wall finishes, ceilings, brick walls, wainscoting, baseboards, tin ceilings. I have this picture of a tin ceiling that was documented by Habs many years ago, but this is the kind of stuff that was actually destroyed. And it was lost. A lot of it was lost. So in 2019, an article came out in the DCS, and they said, David Maloney, DC State Historic Preservation Officer, said in his testimony on Tuesday that the city and the developer have reached a memorandum of understanding requiring that Freeman, her development company, Freeman was the one redeveloping it to become Planet Word, restore some of what was lost. 3 historic rooms and some finishes throughout the building will have to be replicated. So an interior designation is a big deal. If you're going to destroy an interior feature, you're going to have to correct that, right? And so I want to mention this because this is sort of a unique case when you're talking about interior designations, and it's one you should know about if you're going to talk about interior designations. And this also shows the importance of documentation, photo documentation, like what Habs has done here. That's why the Historic American Building Survey is one of the most significant preservation programs our government has ever done, because They've helped document so many buildings. And if you don't have photo documentation, if you don't have text documentation, when something is lost, it's very, very, very hard to recreate or restore. Okay, so let's finish out the list. Other designations. We have the DC Recorder of Deeds. This was another DCPL nomination for an interior. This is actually on our most endangered places list. It's been on the list for many years. The building's not publicly accessible. It's had some structural issues with its roof, water damage, things like that. But there's these really significant murals in the Recorder of Deeds building, including this one you see here with Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln. This was designed by Nathan C. Wyeth. He was another municipal architect and completed in 43 in that strict classical style I mentioned earlier with Folger. The Waffle Shop. I think a lot of Washingtonians are familiar with this institution. This building was streamlined, modern in style. It's famous for its neon signage. And this is an interesting example of a building being moved, which I know I mentioned earlier, that's not typically, preservationists aren't typically too excited about a building being moved, but in this particular case, it was so important to have this building be preserved in some capacity. So this building was actually disassembled. It used to be across from the Ford's Theater on 10th Street, and it was moved up to K near Mount Vernon Square. And now you can go there today and you can eat there. The Equitable Cooperative Building Association. This is an Arthur B. Heaton and Frederick B. Pyle designed bank down on F Street. This is another example of adaptive reuse. This former bank is now Succotash Restaurant. I think at another point it was also a club at some point, but now you can go see this space and you can eat dinner there, and it's an interior designation, which is kind of cool. It's one of 2 banks that's designated. We'll talk about the other bank in a minute. And then Warner Theater Building. This exterior was designated in 83. The interior was added in 85. I think some of you were on the Warner Theater tour last Monday, which was an awesome tour, and we got to see that beautiful Renaissance Revival style space, right? And there's so much gilding. You can see a picture here I took last Monday of the Grand Foyer. When you look at that picture, you're like, okay, and that makes sense why that's designated, right? This is the only theater that's designated here in the district. And as I mentioned too briefly, that there was a restoration and rehab done in the late 1980s, early 1990s, and they restored a lot of features, including a lot of regilding. And throughout the nomination, when you read about the Warner, the nomination talks about the importance of photo documentation and how they were able to reconstruct and restore certain spaces in the theater. Let's see, here we got Corcoran Gallery of Art. This is another old designation from 1964, because it's such a significant building. They wanted to acknowledge that way back in 64, but the interior was added more recently in 2015. This is a Beaux-Arts designed by a significant architect named Ernest Flagg. It was completed in 1897. The nomination says how it's an excellent example of French Beaux-Arts rationality and spatial planning. The structure consists of 3 distinct units: the gallery, the school, and the hemicycle. And this is, of course, now part of George Washington University. And the nomination mentions that along with Union Station, it's probably the most significant Beaux-Arts style design here in the district. So you can see why it has an interior designation. The Chevy Chase Arcade, this is a fun one up in the Chevy Chase neighborhood. It's really, unless someone can tell me another one, I think it's the only arcade I can think of here in the district. You usually think of a shopping arcade and when you're in the cities of Europe, right? When you think of going to Paris or London or Milan, something like that. But this is unique and it has an interior designation because the arcade is such a significant part of this building. Okay, let's deep dive on 2 of these and then we can finish out the presentation and then we can answer some questions and maybe here's some of your comments and hear what some of your guys' favorites are. So the Eastern Market building was designated in 64, an early designation. The interior was added in 1991. The nomination sponsor was the Friends of the Eastern Market. This is another Adolf Kluss designed. As a reminder, Kluss is the one who designed Franklin School. And I think you can kind of tell that when you see both buildings and their brick masonry. It says, the nomination says, the entire interior of the Eastern Market is significant in the area of architecture because it's the last remaining intact interior of the several markets that were built during the Civil War and Reconstruction. Of course, many of you who are very interested in DC architecture and history know that a lot of the markets throughout the city, including Center Market or Northern Liberties Market, a lot of them are demoed. And that's really what makes Eastern Market so significant. In addition, it demonstrates the continuum of construction technology over the 40-year period between 1870 and 1910. The interior of the Eastern Market is divided into 5 discrete spaces, all of which currently retain their original architectural detailing and historic integrity. So here I have a picture from Habs back in 1972 of the South Hall, but the interior designation also includes the central bay of the South Hall, the basement, the center hall, and the North Hall. And when I think of Eastern Market, I think of this as such a significant symbol of the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And it's a very precious building to the Capitol Hill neighborhood. So I can see how this has an interior designation. And then finally, I want to finish with Federal American National Bank. This was added to the DC inventory in 1990, the National Register in 94 for history and architecture. I'm sure you're seeing a common theme that architecture is sort of crucial when you're talking about interior designations, right? Because so much of it is about the architecture of the space, not a significant event that happened in that space. This was designed by Alfred C. Bosom and Jules Henri de Sibor in the classical revival style. It was completed in 1926. And this is a fun one because you can actually go visit this one when we talk about public and private spaces. This is another one that you can eat at, kind of like Succotash, because this now has the restaurant Le Grand Boucherie. And I just want to read, as you look at these 2 photos, the interior is described in a contemporary newspaper article as of Spanish design and finished with variegated George Washington freestone from Virginia. Walls and balustrades are decorated with Ionic pilasters, bas relief panels of griffins and other classical motifs. Blind arches on the east and south walls echo the 5 arched windows along the north wall, overlooking G Street. The main ceiling has gilded and polychromatic finishes and ornate octagonal coffers. The ceiling below, which you can definitely see there in that picture on the right, the ceilings below the mezzanines incorporate dropped beams. The banking counter along the east wall, opposite the entrance, and other fixtures, including a chandelier with ornate grillwork, appear to be original. And just remember, this was written back in the early 1990s, and it's since been rehabbed and converted to a restaurant. The thing I really enjoy about the space is how when you come up, you're in this little foyer, and you don't quite see the banking room, and then you reach the top of that staircase, and then you see this really stunning gilded ceiling and that chandelier. And you're like, okay, I got it. This is why this is an interior designation. Like, this just stands out in downtown Washington. And obviously it's a fun space to eat at, and another example of how, we have change in use, right, in these interior designations. So with that, I would love to open it up to questions and comments, anything that people want to add. So let's see here. Hey, maybe we don't have any questions. Maybe I did cover everything about interior designations. Okay, I had a feeling something was coming in. Okay. So Jim Myers is asking, after the Eastern Market fire, do they remodel under HPO supervision? So I'm not, when was the fire? Does someone want to give me a year, Jim or someone else? And I will add too, just as someone's adding that information in, with these interior designations, they're supposed to, right? They're supposed to follow HPO guidance, receive HPO. Oh, Jim says about 20 years ago. So, theoretically, yes, they're supposed to make these changes with HPO supervision, right? We also know, though, if anyone's ever remodeled a house, as you saw with Planet Word, it takes vigilance on either the public's part or the owner's part to, try and work with the city and with the permitting and the historic preservation office and all that. So I don't know the specifics here, but yes, theoretically, they're supposed to work with the city. And an example of this, and I know Jim was on the tour last week at Warner Theater, I was mentioning to the manager there, I was like, hey, I want to definitely connect you with the historic preservation office because I think it would be useful. So I think us as preservationists, I think that we should always be like, opening those connections and letting people know, like, oh, by the way, this is an interior designation, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily always think about that or know about that. So it's our jobs as preservationists, people that love history, that love architecture, to share this information with people and let them know. Because As you saw with Planet Word, it's really bad when those processes are not followed. So Jim is asking, are there any pending interior designations? That's a great question. So there is a current DC inventory designation for the Greyhound Terminal down on New York Avenue. And DCPL has worked with the Art Deco Society of Washington on a new nomination that will beef up the important history of that terminal related to the civil rights movement, because that was one of two bus terminals in downtown Washington that had the freedom rides of, I think that was 1961. And this new additional documentation will also include an interior designation of particular spaces within there. So yes, there's at least one I can name and one that's coming from DCPL. Okay, someone asked during the Warner tour, okay, so someone else who was on the tour, the manager said there was a designation that he absolutely did not want because of its rigidity. What is that about? Yeah, that's a really good question, and I encounter that a lot in my job. It's that division between the inventory, the DC inventory, and the National Register, and he was referring to the register. But as I mentioned to you all earlier on the call, the register is much more honorary. If anything, it's beneficial because there's historic tax credits available. And I think and it's a very fair misunderstanding, because the National Register, it sounds really serious, right? It sounds like the government, it sounds like the IRS or something, that you have to follow these rules. But really, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the teeth of regulation is at the local level. And the Warner Theater is already subject to local regulation by being in the DC inventory. But I love the question, and that someone commented on that, because that's a really important piece. And I think there's often a misunderstanding that the register is the more significant one, when it's actually not. It's the inventory from a regulatory standpoint. Good question. Okay, let's see if there's any comments or other questions. Oh, here we go, another one. Okay, so are there any classifications for interior public spaces that can receive some sort of recognition? DuPont Underground comes to mind, even though it's not an independent building. Also, unsure if that's privately owned by their nonprofit or the city. So I guess maybe the question, are you getting at that, can we designate spaces that aren't in buildings? Is that maybe your question? And I don't see why the law wouldn't allow us to do that. I don't see why it wouldn't allow there to be a nomination for DuPont Underground. I think what it always comes down to, I tell people this, it's making that argument of historic and or architectural significance. That's what it all comes down to. If you can make a really compelling argument that this space, this interior space, is so significant to the history and architecture here in the district, then you have a good case. And I don't know, does DuPont Underground, thinking about it, does that rise to an interior designation? I don't know, but maybe it does. And then you're also asking about privately owned by their nonprofit or the city. So as you know, as I mentioned earlier, there's no owner consent in the district. And so we have buildings and structures that have all sorts of government ownership, corporation ownership, homeowner ownership. I mean, it runs the gamut, right? What about the Renwick, especially the upstairs ballroom? Great question. Also because the Renwick, funny enough, that was the original home of the Corcoran, right? And then the Corcoran built that building that I talked about today. No, the Renwick does not have an interior designation, and none of the Smithsonian buildings have interior designation. That doesn't mean it couldn't happen. But I think in a particular case like that, you would have to see probably the motivation from the Smithsonian to do an interior designation. But some of their buildings are listed for exteriors. Okay, we'll give a couple more minutes and then we can wrap this up. If no other questions or comments come in, I just wanted to give people a chance to write anything. I still would love to hear if people have a particular favorite interior designation I covered today, or one that, or is there one that you're like, oh, I'm actually surprised that's an interior designation. I think that'd be an interesting angle as well. Yeah, someone said Folger's their favorite. Yeah, that's one of my favorites too. I think that that main reading room, like I said, I love that stained glass window. The Seven Ages of Man, I just think that's a really, really cool space. Feels like you're in London, doesn't even feel like you're in Washington. Yeah, very atmospheric, someone's saying, which I agree with. And also the theater is included too in that designation, as you guys might have seen, and that kind of brings to mind the Globe Theater, right? When you're in that space. National Building Museum, that's if someone's asking about that. Yeah, surprisingly, that doesn't have an interior designation, which when you're standing in that massive room, that's such a, it's, I'm overusing these words, incredible, amazing, all that, right? But that, I mean, that space, it really is incredible. But no, that does not have an interior designation, but you would think that would be another great example. Yes, so I love that someone asked this too. They're wondering if, I know we have a good question to finish out our conversation today, but someone's wondering if this list is online. And I love that question because yes, so go to DC Historic Sites and go to our tour section and you'll see a tour maybe about halfway down the list that's called Historic Designated Interiors. And that includes this entire list that I went through today. And I think it's geographically organized. But you can definitely go back through if there was anything you missed today or you wanted to get the name or the address of one of those properties again, definitely check that out. That's up to date. That includes the newest designation I told you about, the John Joseph Early House. And then, okay, yeah, okay, we're getting more comments and questions. This is great. So someone said, why is Library of Congress Great Hall not designated? When it's such an impressive room space in the Western Hemisphere, which, yeah, I would agree. It is a great space, especially when you're standing out from that viewpoint, right, looking down. So this is a very topical question. So Section 106, which lays out federal historic preservation processes, when Congress wrote the law, they exempted themselves through the Capitol, through the US Capitol and all of the auxiliary buildings. So like the Russell Senate Office Building, Cannon, so on and so forth, and Library of Congress, because as we all know, that's part of the legislative branch. They exempted the Supreme Court, and then they exempted, you probably are all thinking where this is going, they exempted the White House and grounds. And so, yeah, like Library of Congress, Great Hall, it's not designated as an interior space. The building's a National Historic Landmark, but I think that because of how the law is written, I think it would be less likely to get an interior designation of that space. Anything's possible, but I think because of Library of Congress, where it stands within the regulatory process, it would be maybe a little unlikely. Kind of like how, you know, if you think about it, like why isn't the House and the Senate chambers designated, right? Those are really, really famous interiors, right? Architecturally and historically, but you know, those aren't included. So important to remember Section 107. It's also really relevant to right now what's going on with the ballroom being constructed. And then someone said any protections for government buildings that might be sold or altered, White House, FBI, HUD. Yeah, this is another great question that fits in with the one I just answered, where Section 106, now it might not apply to the White House, the Capitol, or the Supreme Court, but it very much applies to buildings like HUD, FBI, so on and so forth. So that's another important thing to keep in mind is that when you know, whenever there's a federal undertaking, whether that's license or money or, you know, a change in ownership, say a federal courthouse becoming something public, or no, I shouldn't say public, becoming something private, like a business or a hotel or something, those Section 106 processes kick in. And that's where it's really important to be, you know, an informed citizen, vigilant, paying attention to the processes, and then also keeping in touch with organizations like DCPL, where we can monitor the situation and maybe be a party to the Section 106 process or something like that. So that's a great question, and it's very relevant right now with potential change in ownership of some of these government buildings. But I think really just to kind of wrap this up and to answer just these questions is, I think you're noticing that a lot of the interior designations I mean, I think when I went through the list, I think the only government building was Recorder of Deeds, and that's a DC government building. So, you know, anything's possible. Interior designations can be on any kind of building, but I think you're probably thinking, oh, it's actually interesting. A lot of these actually are more residential or more commercial or something like that, or former public school. You're not really seeing a lot of federal buildings. And because, of course, when you have an interior designation, there is for certain processes you have to follow, and you're being held to a slightly higher standard as a steward of the property, right? The Planet Word example is one I can continue to go back to. So anyway, I think that's a good place to end today. Thank you so much, everyone who joined today. This was fun to talk through this process. I'm always happy to answer questions if anyone wants to reach out to me at zach@dcpreservation.org. And if you have any ideas for potential nominations or why something hasn't been added or should it be added, I am always happy to talk about that. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.